Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about the Weepy voiced killer. Content warning here, you will be hearing audio. I will put timestamps if you want to skip that audio, but that is the only thing that will be shown / heard here. Every so often, we come across criminals that manage to set themselves apart from others due to odd and sometimes unexplainable behavior. Some killers become larger than their own name. They get their own moniker, representing some aspect of their methodology. This is what happened with Paul Michael Stefani, who later became known as the Weepy voiced killer. Initially, this moniker doesn't sound as intimidating as many others, but as we discuss the details of his crimes, it becomes quite chilling. In many ways, Stefani's life seemed to be, as far as we know, relatively typical until the killings began. Stefani was born on September 8th, 1944 in Austin, Minnesota. Stefani had 9 siblings and his family was highly religious. There aren't many details surrounding his childhood and upbringing aside from the aforementioned. Therefore, there is a bit of mystery as to what his life was like until he turned 36. The little that is known is that he suffered from mental illness, though there are no confirmed specifics as to what illness exactly. The only other detail is that he was convicted of aggravated assault prior to the killings. Stefani ended up moving from Austin to St. Paul, still in Minnesota. Much of what is found online about his life is centered on the killings, and there's very little emphasis on his life outside of that. However, a few details that are interesting and that render the case more disturbing is that Stefani was married to a woman named Beverly Leiter, with whom he ended up having a daughter. Private life aside, Stefani worked as a janitor. Stefani and Leiter ended up divorcing, and Stefani allegedly lived with his girlfriend. The first kill occurred on New Year's Eve, 1980. Like most people on New Year's Eve, a university student named Karen Potak was partying with her sisters, celebrating. She had just arrived in St. Paul. It is extremely cold out, but nonetheless, she left the party once it was officially the new year and midnight had passed. She allegedly was walking around the city. Potak, as far as we know, did not have appropriately warm clothing for the freezing temperature. So when a stranger with a car pulled up and asked if she needed a ride, it was easy to accept over the cold. It is important to note that she was intoxicated, making her an easier target for the stranger in the car. Who was who? Stefani. Around 3 hours later, at 3 a.m., the police received a disturbing 911 phone call from Stefani. He requested that the police come to Pierce Butler Road at the Malberg Manufacturing Company because there was a, quote, girl hurt there. During the call, the officer responding asked who he was talking to which he got no response, unsurprisingly. The police went to the described location and found a truly distressing scene. The officers found Potak naked near railroad tracks and in the snow. It was immediately clear that she had undergone severe violence and was heavily injured. She had been beaten with a tire iron to the point where her skull was not only cracked, but her brain was actually visible. Fortunately, Potak survived even through this unimaginable trauma. Unfortunately, the brain injuries made it so that Potak was unable to identify her attacker. Stefani was still on the loose and no one knew who they were looking for. Sergeant Joe Corcoran, who was part of the squad that went to the crime scene, said in regards of Potak that it was, quote, the most devastating scene I'd seen in my career. The 911 phone call from Stefani did not immediately amount to much, as the police had no idea who was making these high-pitched phone calls. However, future events would make it so that these phone calls became a morbid tradition. As he couldn't be identified, Stefani was free to continue roaming the streets and effectively being a threat to any woman that might cross his path. June 3rd, 1981, in Minneapolis was where he next took his opportunity to attack an 18-year-old student from Wisconsin named Kimberly Compton. The way in which Stefani killed Compton once again showed the unbridled violence that resided within. Compton's body was found near a freeway that was still under construction and therefore not particularly frequented. Once more, the police received a phone call from none other than Stefani, where he tearily and anxiously told them he had stabbed Compton with an ice pick. She'd been stabbed a total of 61 times with said ice pick. Sergeant Corcoran said he saw, quote, extreme rage in this one. This time Stefani called again a few days later to say he was sorry for what he'd done. This is when he gained the moniker the Weepy-voiced killer. It's important to note that during the first phone call, he is quoted saying, "Goddamn, will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody." In the second phone call, he said, "I'm sorry for what I did." Apparently, he was so allegedly devastated or in a state of shock that his words were barely coherent. These two instances were what got him his moniker. The voice coming through these phone calls sounded panicked and as if he was having a hard time breathing due to profusely crying. Though we cannot ascertain what the meaning and purpose of these calls was, it is clear that there was some sort of turmoil within Stefani. These calls, like with other killers who contact the police, may have been simply to gain more notoriety, or they may have been ways for Stefani to feel absolved from his crimes, or, the least likely in my opinion, true remorse. One might argue that true remorse would include simply turning himself in and getting treatment somewhere. Why he called, we'll likely never know. Whether he enjoyed committing these crimes or not, the aftermath seemed to be panic and fear, hence the crying and voice. Though the police recognized that this was the same voice they'd heard before, they weren't able to identify who was calling, only what payphone the call had come from. So, once more, the Weepy-voiced killer continued to live an everyday life, unencumbered by being investigated or even looked at twice in the street. Shortly after Compton's death, a man confessed the murders. Ideally, it would have been Stefani, so he finally could be put behind bars and kept away from the public. Unfortunately, the confession received was fake. Alan Lopez was a man who was keeping his family hostage. Negotiations were had with the investigators, and that is when he revealed that he in fact was responsible for the murder of Kimberly Compton. It is not directly clear why he claimed her specific murder as one he was responsible of, but in a strange way he had a few similarities with Stefani. He too had a history of assault charges and suffered with mental illness. The authorities believed they'd found the criminal behind these heinous actions because for about 6 months they'd received no calls. The lack of calls, though, was not the confirmation they thought it was. Lopez had taken his own life. Then another Weepy call came in and they had confirmation that they'd not actually found the right man. Slightly more than a year later, a third victim was found on a Minneapolis river. Her name was Barbara Simons, and her cause of death was stabbing. She was stabbed more than 100 times. Unfortunately, Simons had been at the wrong place at the wrong time. She was at a bar where she met Stefani, who offered her a cigarette, and from then on, as expected, his intentions were murderous. Per usual, Stefani lured Simons by offering her a ride from the bar. Sadly, Simons told a waitress, "He's cute. I hope he's nice, since he's giving me a ride home." Simons never made it home. Again, Stefani called to apologize for stabbing Simons and even admitted to the murder of Compton. His regular calls made him immediately recognizable to the authorities, as it was not only unusual, but his teary voice made him an outlier in the types of calls they'd received. As they'd met at a bar, luckily a waitress identified Stefani and mentioned he was the last person she'd seen Simons with. When identified, the authorities also discovered that Stefani had worked at the Marlboro manufacturing plant. He had in fact been fired from the plant a mere 3 years before he left Potak there with a cracked skull. Though now Stefani was being watched as he'd been identified, this did not stop him from continuing with his raging pursuit of women to beat and kill. In August of 1982, Stefani went to the red light district looking for a prostitute. It is significant to remember that sex workers are often targeted by those who want to hurt or kill them because the authorities often take those cases less seriously, involve less investigators, or because the circumstances under which the sex workers worked made it harder to track them down or find friends and family to help. Stefani met up with a prostitute named Denise Williams. They went to his domicile and had relations, after which he offered to take her back to her place of work. Instead of taking a typical and more frequented roads, Stefani drove down a secluded alley, alleging it would save them time. However, Williams followed her intuition and felt something was not right. This foresight on her behalf would end up saving her life. Stefani had a glass bottle in his car, and Williams saw it, planning on using it as a defense weapon if anything strange were to occur. Williams was incredibly smart on planning ahead, as towards the end of the alley, Stefani stabbed her in the stomach with a screwdriver. Ready to act, Williams slammed the bottle on Stefani's head. This caused severe enough injury that Stefani had to call emergency services to help the bleeding stop. Fortunately as well, after the bottle smashing on Stefani's head, Williams' screams attracted a man in the vicinity, which caused Stefani to run away. Unfortunately for Stefani, due to his immensely recognizable voice, when he called emergency services for his wounds, his voice was immediately identified and paired with that of the Weepy-voiced killer. Thankfully, Williams survived the attack, and also thanks to the corroboration of the man who caused Stefani to run away, the authorities connected this case to Stefani. Aggravatingly though, the police arrested, convicted, and charged Stefani with the murder of Simons, but they weren't able to connect him to the Weepy voice killer. This was in some ways shocking, as even his sister and ex-wife confirmed that it was in fact his voice on those phone calls. It was the voice of Stefani confessing to these murders and attempted murders. Prior to Williams' attack, investigators even broadcasted the 911 phone calls from the Weepy voice killer, hoping that someone might recognize the voice and give them confirmation of his identity or potential identity. The public response was rather significant, but as his voice was distorted by the crying and panic, it was hard to tell who exactly they were dealing with. Several calls were tracked to phone booths, but it was always too long before authorities arrived, and he'd already be gone. Here are some of those chilling phone calls.
Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. I am so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every night. I can't believe it. It's just like a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
Play your emergency.
Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one. Oh, my safe. I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm sick. I'm going to kill myself, I think.
Where are you?
I'm just going to... If somebody dies with a red shirt on, it's me. I killed both of you. I'm sorry. I'll never make it to heaven. Oh, you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody. Yes, please. This is an emergency. Please send a squad to Pierce Butler Road, Molenberg Manufacturing Company, machine shop. Please, there's an ambulance too. There's a girl hurt there.
Can you tell me what happened to her?
Just hurry. She's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks, by the edge here. Hurry.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you?
Stefani ended up being convicted for the attack on Williams and the murder of Simons. Unfortunately, the rest of his violence was not immediately followed by consequences, as they could not confirm he was the Weepy Voice killer. However, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison for Williams and Simon's death. Though justice was not achieved, as there was no recognition for the death of Compton and the assault of Potak, a decade later, some form of justice would come. After 10 years in prison, it turned out that Stefani had melanoma and was given a year left to live. These circumstances might have changed his mind as he reached out to Sergeant Corcoran and admitted the assaults and murders that the police were uncertain of. He admitted to Compton, Simons, and one other victim. However, conveniently, he did not remember details regarding her, except that he, quote-unquote, found her in a bathtub. Her name was Kathleen Greening. Stefani had drowned her in that same bathtub where he had allegedly found her. But unlike other times, he did not make his sobbing phone call. This time he was quiet. This was a paramount reason why he was not connected to that killing, and why Greening's death went unsolved for over a decade. Why did he not make the call? Was he not regretful or pretending to be this time? Was he so removed from reality that he did not fully comprehend what he'd done? Though it seems, once his memory was jogged, that during the killing of Greening, he said he heard voices telling him to kill and that it felt like he was playing a game while killing her. He also told police details about Greening's home that only the killer would have been aware of. To cement the fact that he was in fact the killer, the police also recovered Greening's address book, where there was a phone number under the name Paul S. He ended up getting 58 years in prison, but died at the young age of 53. There are a myriad of factors that make the Weepy Voice killer such a bizarre character. Obviously, the phone calls to the police were something that can be established as far from the norm, and also, to some degree, unexplainable. It's relatively easy to come up with scenarios as to why he might have done that. Some we've already mentioned. Guilt, feigning guilt, wanting help, genuinely due to mental illness or distress, simply wanting, in some respects, to show off his crimes. The list could go on. Psychiatrist Park Dietz commented on the purpose and meaning of the phone calls. Quote, "It's an unusual thing for serial violent offenders to communicate with law enforcement during their offenses. Some of them are doing it to taunt police. Some of them do it so they can get more credit. What I don't take it to mean ever is a desire to be caught. I don't think people capable of serial homicides feel enough guilt." This statement by Dietz is particularly poignant, considering that, aside from the phone calls, the Weepy Voice killer could have turned himself in if he was so concerned about his past and potential future actions. One unexpected factor that makes this case all the more strange is that all of the victims were red in some respect. In fact, crime reporter Carolyn Lowe, who worked over 3 decades at WCCO-TV, said she made the conscious decision to not wear any red for this specific reason. Perhaps it was all a coincidence, but nonetheless very strange. Stefani, the Weepy Voice killer, shows the public, as if we need another lesson, that serial killers can go relatively unnoticed. They may blend in with a crowd rather easily, whether it's for the aesthetic reasons or just being an average Joe with a job and a family. However, it is a hard lesson to learn, as it could make one paranoid about everyone at that point. What we do know is that these chilling phone calls set him apart from a majority of serial killers and make the public have more questions than answers. Is this a failure of the mental health system? Is this someone who never wanted help? Questions such as these continue to resurface as one thinks of the details of what Stefani did and how he went about it. What is telling is that Stefani only wanted to come clean when he was sick and his life effectively had an expiration date. While it is important for the families to have closure, which he allegedly wanted, it is also a convenient way to finally confess when one knows the consequences of both the law and the public won't affect them for much longer. To many, this would not seem like guilt or actual care for the families as much as a way to die without the burden on one's shoulders. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons as always, and I'll catch you guys next time.